There are no diplomatic or bilateral relations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Ukraine and Russia are in a state of war since February 2022. Following the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity in 2014, Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula was occupied by unmarked Russian forces, and later annexed by Russia, while pro-Russia separatists simultaneously engaged the Ukrainian military in an armed conflict for control over eastern Ukraine. These events marked the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian War. In a major escalation of the conflict on February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of the Ukrainian mainland across a broad front, causing Ukraine to sever all formal diplomatic ties with Russia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the successor states' bilateral relations have undergone periods of ties, tensions, and outright hostility. In the early 1990s, Ukraine's policy was dominated by aspirations to ensure its sovereignty and independence, followed by a foreign policy that balanced cooperation with the European Union, Russia, and other powerful polities. Relations between the two countries became hostile after the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution, which was followed by Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, and due to Russia's backing for the separatist fighters of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic in a war. Conflicts that had killed more than 13,000 people by early 2020, and brought Western sanctions on Russia. Numerous bilateral agreements have been terminated and economic ties severed. Throughout 2021 and 2022, a Russian military buildup on the border of Ukraine escalated tensions between the two countries and strained their bilateral relations. Ukraine broke diplomatic relations with Moscow in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Streets bearing the names of Russian figures and monuments symbolizing Russian and Ukrainian friendship were removed from various locations across Ukraine. Country comparison. History of relations. Kievan Rus. Both Russia and Ukraine claim their heritage from Kievan Rus, a polity that united most of the East Slavic and some Finnic tribes and adopted Byzantine Orthodoxy in the 9th to 11th centuries. According to Old Rus chronicles, Kyiv, the capital of modern Ukraine, was proclaimed the mother of Rus cities, as it was the capital of the powerful late medieval state of Rus. Muscovy and the Russian Empire. After the Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, the histories of the people inhabiting territories of Russia and Ukraine diverged. The Grand Duchy of Moscow united all remnants of Russia's northern provinces and evolved into the Russian state. The Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia came under the domination of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, followed by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Within the Commonwealth, the militant Zaporozhian Cossacks refused Polonization, and often clashed with a Commonwealth government controlled by the Polish nobility. Unrest among the Cossacks caused them to rebel against the Commonwealth and seek union with Russia, with which they had similarities in culture, language, and religion. This was formalized through the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654. Starting in the mid-17th century, much of Ukraine's territory was gradually annexed by the Russian Empire and its autonomy taken away by the time of the late 18th century partition of Poland. Soon after, the Cossack host was forcibly disbanded by the Russian Empire and most Cossacks were relocated to the Kuban region on the southern edge of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire considered Ukrainians ethnically Russian, and referred to them as Little Russians. Until the end of World War I, this view was only opposed by a small group of Ukrainian nationalists. Nevertheless, a perceived threat of Ukrainian separatism set in motion a set of measures aimed at the Russification of the Little Russians. In 1804, the Ukrainian language was banned from schools as a subject and language of instruction. In 1876, Alexander II's secretary Mzukaz prohibited the publication and importation of most Ukrainian language books, public performances, and lectures in the Ukrainian language, and even the printing of Ukrainian texts accompanying musical scores. Soviet Union, Ukrainian People's Republic, Holodomor, Ukrainian independence. Nationalism spread following Mikhail Gorbachev's political liberalization of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. 29 The pro-independence People's Movement of Ukraine was founded in 1989. After the Congress of People's Deputies of Russia made the declaration of state sovereignty of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the Verkhovna Rada of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic made a similar declaration on July 16, 1991, 29 following the 1991 Soviet coup d'état attempt. The Declaration of Independence of Ukraine was passed on August 24, 1991 with one vote against, 31. The subsequent 1991 Ukrainian independence referendum approved this by a nationwide majority of 92.3% and majorities in every region of Ukraine. 33. The basis for post-Soviet relations were set by the Beloved Accords between the new Ukrainian leader Leonid Kravchuk and Russia's President Boris Yeltsin, alongside the Belarusian leader Stanislav Shushkevich. 33. While the leaders agreed to formally dissolve the Soviet Union, the Russians wanted to create new supranational structures to replace it, to the opposition of the Ukrainians. 35. While this led to the establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States, it did result in any legally binding commitments. 35. While Anatoly Sobchak claimed that the creation of a Ukrainian military would be a time bomb under the future of humanity, independent armed forces of Ukraine were soon established. 34-35. Current relations. 1990s. Nuclear disarmament. Division of the Black Sea Fleet and Sevastopol. Economics. 2000s. Although disputes existed prior to the 2004 Ukrainian presidential election, including speculation about the accidental shooting down of a Russian airliner by the Ukrainian military and the controversy over Tuzla Island, relations with Russia under the latter years of Leonid Kuchma's term improved. In 2002, the Russian government participated in financing the construction of the Khmelnytskyi and the Rivne nuclear power plants. In 2003, Russia secured cooperation agreement over the Kerch Strait and attempted to integrate Ukraine into a new Russian-led single economic space with Russia. However, with President Viktor Yushchenko in power, several problems resurfaced, including the Russia-Ukraine gas disputes due to Ukraine's growing cooperation with the EU and bid to join NATO. The overall perception of relations with Russia and Ukraine differs largely on regional factors. Many Russophone eastern and southern regions, which are also home to the majority of the Russian diaspora in Ukraine, welcome closer relations with Russia. However, further central and particularly western regions of Ukraine show a less friendly attitude to the idea of a historic link to Russia and the Soviet Union in particular. In Russia, there is no regional breakdown in the opinion of Ukraine, but on the whole, Ukraine's recent attempts to join the EU and NATO were seen as change of course to only a pro-Western, anti-Russian orientation of Ukraine and thus a sign of hostility, and this resulted in a drop of Ukraine's perception in Russia. This was further fueled by the public discussion in Ukraine of whether the Russian language should be given official status and be made the second state language. During the 2009 gas conflict, the Russian media almost uniformly portrayed Ukraine as an aggressive and greedy state that wanted to ally with Russia's enemies and exploit cheap Russian gas. Further worsening of relations was provoked by belligerent statements made in 2007-2008 by both Russian and Ukrainian politicians. For example, the former Foreign Minister Boris Tarasiuk, Deputy Justice Minister of Ukraine Evan Kornishuk, and then Leader of Parliamentary Opposition Yulia Tymoshenko. The status of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol remained a matter of disagreement and tensions. Second Tymoshenko government. 2010s. Viktor Yanukovych presidency. Economic integration and Euromaidan. Annexation of Crimea and war in eastern Ukraine. Continued deterioration of relations. Volodymyr Zelensky presidency. 2020s. On February 2, 2021, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky decided to shut down pro-Russian TV channels owned by the parliamentary deputy Taras Kozak, a close associate of Viktor Medvedchuk, the godfather of the daughter of Russia President Vladimir Putin. Medvedchuk is also said to be the real owner of the pro-Russian TV channels. As part of the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war, fighting escalated in the first quarter of 2021, with 25 Ukrainian soldiers dying in the conflict, compared to the 50 that died in 2020 according to Ukrainian authorities. In late March 2021, large movements of military equipment were reported in various areas within Russia, with the equipment headed to Crimea, and the Rostov and Voronezh oblasts. Various intelligence in the following months, including a statement from Russian news agency TASS, put the number of troops situated in the southern military district which borders the Donbas conflict zone at 85,000 to 90,000. Despite reassurances from a Russian government official that the troops pose no threat, Russian official Dmitry Kozak stated that Russian forces will act to defend Russian citizens in Ukraine, and any escalation would lead to the beginning of the end of Ukraine. Other politicians such as German Chancellor Angela Merkel and United States White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki have made comments, Merkel phoning Putin demanding a reversal of the build-up, and Psaki describing the build-up as the largest since 2014. In late October, Russian news agency TASS reported massive drills occurring in the Astrakhan Oblast involving over 1,000 personnel and 300 pieces of military hardware, which included the Buk S-300, and Tor M2 missile systems. In July 2021, Putin published an essay titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, in which he states that Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians should be in one all-Russian nation as a part of the Russian world and are one people whom forces that have always sought to undermine our unity wanted to divide and rule. The essay denies the existence of Ukraine as an independent nation. On December 7, 2021, American President Joe Biden spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin via a secure video link regarding the build-up of Russian military presence and increase in tensions on the Ukrainian border in response to Ukraine's intent to join NATO, which Putin described as a security threat. These tensions also came in line with the election of Volodymyr Zelensky, who pushed back against Russian encroachment on Ukrainian sovereignty. During the video conference, Putin said Western military activity in Ukraine was approaching a red line, repeating that he saw it as a threat toward Russian national security. Biden responded by stating that the United States was ready to impose various economic sanctions more harmful than the post-Crimea annexation sanctions if Russia were to take military actions, most notably floating the possibility of cutting Russia out from the global financial telecommunication giant Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, or SWIFT. However, European leaders feared that this step might provoke an even harsher response from Russia. On December 9, 2021, an incident occurred involving the Ukrainian command ship Donbas, which had set sail from the port of Mariupol at 9:12 Moscow time, heading towards the Kerch Strait. According to the FSB, the vessel did not react to a request to change course, but later headed back. The Russian Foreign Ministry labeled this incident as a provocation, whilst Ukraine dismissed the Russian grievances as part of an information attack on Kyiv. On the same day, Joe Biden called Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky regarding the tensions in the Donbas region and internal reform in Ukraine, with Zelensky issuing a statement thanking Biden for the strong support. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki told reporters that the president's intention going into this call was to provide an update for President Zelensky on his call with President Putin and underscore our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Despite these reassurances, Biden stressed the idea that the United States is going to unilaterally use force to confront Russia from invading Ukraine is not in the cards right now, but that if Russia were to invade Ukraine, there would be severe consequences. U.S. Senator Bob Menendez, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, again proposed the idea of severe sanctions, at the maximum end of the spectrum, and reiterated the possibility of cutting out Russia from SWIFT, saying that Putin himself, as well as his inner circle, would lose access to bank accounts in the West. Russia would effectively be cut off and isolated from the international economic system. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also warned of consequences for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a Russian gas pipeline project operated by Gazprom under the wholly owned subsidiary Nord Stream AG2, which delivers natural gas to Germany. Whilst Biden ruled out direct American military intervention in Ukraine, he mentioned that the United States may be required to reinforce our presence in NATO countries to reassure particularly those in the Eastern Front. Ukrainian General Kyrylo Obudanov said, while speaking to the New York Times, that there are not sufficient military resources for repelling a full-scale attack by Russia if it begins without the support of additional forces, and that without delivery of reserves, there's not an army in the world that can hold out. On February 21, 2022, Russia officially recognized the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, two breakaway states in eastern Ukraine. On the same day, Putin ordered the deployment of troops to territory held by the LPR and the DPR. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson warned that Russia was planning the biggest war in Europe since 1945 as Putin intended to invade and encircle the capital of Kyiv. On February 22, 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he would consider the possibility of severing Ukraine's diplomatic relations with Russia. Although Russia had repeatedly denied any plans to invade Ukraine, the Russian army started an invasion on Ukraine on February 24, with ground and air assaults across many parts of the country including on the capital, Kyiv. President Zelensky announced that Ukraine cut all diplomatic relations with its eastern neighbor. On February 26, 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukrainian soldiers were blocking Russian troops moving on Kyiv, while several Western nations acted on earlier proposed sanctions, cutting off a number of Russian institutions from the world's major financial payments system, SWIFT. Zelensky said he was 99.9% sure that Putin thought the Ukrainians would welcome the invading forces with flowers and smiles. On March 5, 2022, according to the Russian RIA news agency, Russia's foreign ministry urged on European Union and NATO members to stop supplying arms to Ukraine. Moscow is particularly concerned that portable anti-aerial Stinger missiles could fall into terrorist hands, posing a threat to planes, according to the report. Russia had previously supplied anti-aircraft missiles to pro-Russian separatists who downed Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. On April 5, 2022, Liz Truss, the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary, announced that Britain would deploy investigators to Ukraine to assist in the collection of evidence of war crimes, including sexual abuse. On May 10, 2022, it was reported that Russia was responsible for a large-scale cyber attack against Vyazat's Cosat network immediately before the Russian incursion into Ukrainian territory, primarily targeting the Ukrainian military's digital assets. Intelligence from the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Centre stated that the attacks also caused disruption to wind farms and other Internet users in Central Europe. In a statement by the EU Council, the cyber attack also had a significant impact, causing indiscriminate communication outages and disruptions across several public authorities, businesses, and users in Ukraine. President Zelensky's military advisor Oleksiy Arestovych said that up to 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers died in the first 100 days of the war. In early June 2022, Ukrainian politician Mikhailo Podolyak said that up to 200 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in combat every day. On June 17, 2022, Putin told the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum relations between Russia and Ukraine would normalize upon completion of the special military operation. Border. Russia and Ukraine share 2,295 kilometers of border. In 2014, the Ukrainian government unveiled a plan to build a defensive walled system along the border with Russia, named Project Wall. It was expected to cost almost $520 million, take 4 years to complete, and has been under construction as of 2015. In June 2020, the State Border Guard of Ukraine expected that the project would be finished by 2025. On January 1, 2018, Ukraine introduced biometric controls for Russians entering the country. On March 22, 2018, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko signed a decree that required Russian citizens and individuals without citizenship, who come from migration risk countries, to notify the Ukrainian authorities in advance about their reason for traveling to Ukraine. Since November 30, 2018, Ukraine has banned all Russian men between 16 and 60 from entering the country, with exceptions for humanitarian purposes. Armaments and aerospace industries. The Ukrainian and Russian arms and aviation manufacturing sectors remained deeply integrated following the breakup of the Soviet Union. Ukraine is the world's 8th largest exporter of armaments according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and according to analysts cited by the Washington Post, around 70% of Ukraine's defense-related exports flowed to Russia before 2014, or nearly $1 billion. Potentially strategically sensitive exports from Ukraine to Russia included 300 350 helicopter engines per year, as well as various other aircraft engines from Motor Sich in Zaporizhia, intercontinental ballistic missiles from Yuzhmash in Dnipro, missile guidance systems from factories in Kharkiv, 20% of Russia's uranium consumption from mines in Zhovdivody, 60% of the gears used in Russian warships from manufacturers Mykolaiv, and oil and gas from the Sea of Azov. In March 2014, during the 2014 Crimean crisis, Ukraine barred all exports of weaponry and military equipment to Russia. Jane's Information Group believed that while supply may be slowed by the Ukrainian embargo, it was unlikely to do any real damage to Russia's military. Popular opinion and philosophy. In Russia. In opinion polls, Russians generally say they have a more negative attitude towards Ukraine than vice versa. Polls in Russia have shown that after top Russian officials made radical statements or took drastic actions against Ukraine, the attitude of those polled towards Ukraine worsened. The issues that have hurt Russians' view of Ukraine are: possible Ukrainian NATO membership, Ukrainian attempts to have the Holodomor recognized as genocide against the Ukrainian nation, attempts to honor the Ukrainian insurgent army. Although a large majority of Ukrainians voted for independence in December 1991, in the following years the Russian press portrayed Ukraine's independence as the work of nationalists who twisted the correct instincts of the masses, according to a 1996 study. The study argues that this influenced the Russian public to believe that the Ukrainian political elite is the only thing blocking the Ukrainians' heartfelt wish to reunite with Russia. Some members of the Russian political elite continued to claim that Ukrainian is a Russian dialect and that Ukraine should become part of the Russian Federation. In a June 2010 interview, Mikhail Zurabov, then Russian ambassador to Ukraine, stated Russians and Ukrainians are a single nation with some nuances and peculiarities. Ukrainian history is not treated as a separate subject in leading Russian universities but rather incorporated into the history of Russia. According to experts, the Russian government cultivates an image of Ukraine as the enemy to cover up its own internal mistakes. Analysts like Philip P. Pan argued late 2009 that Russian media portrayed the then government of Ukraine as anti-Russian. 80% had a good or very good attitude towards Belarus in 2009. During the 1990s, polls showed that a majority of people in Russia could not accept the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the independence of Ukraine. According to a 2006 poll by Viziem, 66% of all Russians regretted the collapse of the Soviet Union. 50% of respondents in Ukraine in a similar poll held in February 2005 stated they regret the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In 2005 and 2007 polls, Russians expressed a wish to unify with Ukraine, although a unification solely with Belarus was more popular. A poll released on November 5, 2009 showed that 55% of Russians believed that the relationship with Ukraine should be a friendship between two independent states. A late 2011 poll by the Levada Center showed 53% of polled Russians preferred friendship with an independent Ukraine, 33% preferred Ukraine to be under Russia's economic and political control, and 15% were undecided. According to Levada's 2012 poll, 60% of Russians preferred Russia and Ukraine as independent but friendly states with open borders without visas or customs. The number of unification supporters increased by 4% to 20% in Russia. 20 surveys conducted from January 2009 to January 2015 by the Levada Center found that less than 10% of Russians supported Russia and Ukraine becoming one state. In the January 2015 survey, 19% wanted eastern Ukraine to become part of Russia and 43% wanted it to become an independent state. A November 2014 survey by the University of Oslo found that most Russians viewed Ukraine as not legitimate as a state in its internationally recognized borders and with its then government. According to an April 2015 survey by the Levada Center, when asked what should be Russia's primary goals in its relations with vis-a-vis Ukraine, the most common answers were: restoring good neighborly relations, retaining Crimea, developing economic cooperation, preventing Ukraine from joining NATO, making gas prices for Ukraine the same as for other European countries, and ousting the current Ukrainian leadership. In February 2019, 82% of Russians had a positive attitude towards Ukrainians. But only 34% of Russians had a positive attitude towards Ukraine, and only 7% of Russians had positive attitude towards the leadership of Ukraine. Some observers noted what they described as a generational struggle among Russians, with younger Russians more likely to be against Putin and his policies and older Russians more likely to accept the narrative presented by state-controlled media in Russia. According to a March 2021 survey by the Levada Center, 68% of Russians aged 18-24 had favorable views on Ukraine. A Levada poll released in February 2021 found that 80% of Russians supported Ukraine's independence from Russia and only 17% of Russians wanted Ukraine to become part of Russia. Russians' thinking about Ukraine has also been influenced by the Russian world concept and also by nationalist philosophers such as Alexander Dugin, often referred to as Putin's brain. The Russian world concept is a totalitarian ideology based on a specific theology that sees the West's decadence as an enemy of Russian culture, and regards war as a legitimate method of purifying the world from the demonic. Dugin is believed by some to have laid the ideological groundwork for the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 as part of his advocacy for Ukraine becoming a purely administrative sector of the Russian centralized state, which he refers to as Novorossiya, or New Russia. In Ukraine, a poll released on November 5, 2009 showed that about 67% of Ukrainians believed the relationship with Russia should be a friendship between two independent states. According to a 2012 poll by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, 72% of Ukrainians preferred Ukraine and Russia as independent but friendly states with open borders without visas or customs. The number of unification supporters shrunk by 2% to 14% in Ukraine. In December 2014, 85% of Ukrainians rated relations with Russia as hostile or tense, according to a Deutsche Welle survey which did not include Crimea and the separatist-controlled part of Donbass. Gallup reported that 5% of Ukrainians approved of the Russian leadership in a September-October 2014 survey. down from 43% a year earlier. In September 2014, a survey by Alexei Navalny of the mainly Russophone cities of Odessa and Kharkiv found that 87% of residents wanted their region to stay in Ukraine, 3% wanted to join Russia, 2% wanted to join Novorossiya, and 8% were undecided. A KIIS poll conducted in December 2014 found 88.3% of Ukrainians were opposed to joining Russia. According to Al Jazeera, a poll conducted in 2011 showed that 49% of Ukrainians had relatives living in Russia. A recent poll conducted by the independent Russian research center Levada shows that 77% of Ukrainians and 82% of Russians think positively of each other as people. In February 2019, 77% of Ukrainians were positive about Russians, 57% of Ukrainians were positive about Russia, but only 13% of Ukrainians had positive attitude towards the Russian government. In March 2022, a week after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 98% of Ukrainians, including 82% of ethnic Russians living in Ukraine, said they did not believe that any part of Ukraine was rightfully part of Russia, according to Lord Ashcroft's polls, which did not include Crimea and the separatist-controlled part of Donbass. 97% of Ukrainians said they had an unfavorable view of Russian President Vladimir Putin, with a further 94% saying they had an unfavorable view of the Russian armed forces. 81% of Ukrainians said they had a very unfavorable or somewhat unfavorable view of the Russian people. 65% of Ukrainians, including 88% of those of Russian ethnicity, agreed that, despite our differences, there is more that unites ethnic Russians living in Ukraine and Ukrainians than divides us. At the end of 2021, 75% of Ukrainians had a positive attitude toward ordinary Russians, while in May 2022, 82% of Ukrainians had a negative attitude toward ordinary Russians. Treaties and Agreements. 1654 March Articles. Approved by the Cossack Council. Union Workers' Peasants Treaty. Union Treaty approved by the 7th All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets. Ratified by the 9th All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets. 1954 Soviet Decree, transfer of the Crimean Oblast from the RSFSR to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, decreed by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Treaty between the Russian SFSR and the Ukrainian SSR, ratified by the Supreme Council of the Russian SFSR. Ratified by the Supreme Council of Ukraine. Yes, 352, nay, 0. Balavaza Accords. Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. Following the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation and the subsequent war in Donbass in 2014, Ukraine, the US, Canada, the UK, along with other countries, stated that Russian involvement is a breach of its obligations to Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum, a memorandum signed by Bill Clinton, Boris Yeltsin, John Major, and Leonid Kuchma, and in violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Partition Treaty on the Status and Conditions of the Black Sea Fleet, ratified by the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation. The State Duma approved the denunciation of the treaty unanimously by 433 members of Parliament on March 31, 2014. Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation, and Partnership between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Treaty between the Russian Federation and Ukraine on cooperation in the use of the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait. 2010 Kharkiv Pact. Both the Russian and Ukrainian parliaments did ratify the agreement on April 27, 2010. The State Duma approved the denunciation of the treaty unanimously by 433 members of parliament on March 31, 2014. Ukraine terminated several treaties and agreement with Russia since the start of the 2014 Crimea crisis. In December 2019, Ukraine and Russia agreed to implement a complete ceasefire in eastern Ukraine by the year-end. The negotiations were brokered by France and Germany, where the countries in conflict committed an extensive prisoner swap along with withdrawal of Ukraine's military from 3 major regions falling on the front line. On July 17, 2022, Russian, Ukrainian and Turkish military delegations met with United Nations officials in Istanbul to start talks on the resumption of exports of Ukrainian grain from the Black Sea port of Odessa. On July 22, 2022, Russian and Ukrainian officials have signed the deal to allow grain exports from Ukrainian Black Sea ports. Under the agreement, a coalition of Turkish, Ukrainian and UN staff will monitor the loading of grain into vessels in Ukrainian ports, to allay Russian fears of weapons smuggling before navigating a pre-planned route through the Black Sea, which remains heavily mined by Ukrainian and Russian forces. On October 29, 2022, Russia said it was suspending its participation in the grain deal, in response to what it called a major Ukrainian drone attack on its Black Sea fleet. Territorial disputes. A number of territorial disputes exist between two countries. Crimea, including Sevastopol, Kerch Strait, Sea of Azov. Russia lays claims onto territory of Crimea by the Resolution No. 1809-1 of the Supreme Council of the Russian Federation on legal evaluation of decisions of the supreme bodies of state power of the RSFSR about changing the status of Crimea that was adopted in 1954. In 2014, Crimea was annexed by Russia. Ukraine considers this as an annexation and as a violation of international law and agreements by Russia, including the agreement establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States in 1991, Helsinki Accords, Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons of 1994 and Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation and Partnership between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. The event was condemned by many world leaders as an illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory, in violation of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Sovereignty and Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, signed by Russia. It led to the other members of the then G8 suspending Russia from the group, then introducing the first round of sanctions against the country. The United Nations General Assembly also rejected the vote and annexation, adopting a non-binding resolution affirming the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. See also, International reactions to the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation, International sanctions during the Russo-Ukrainian War. Tuzla Island. The Tuzla conflict is unresolved since 2003. Some Russian nationalists have disputed Ukraine's independent existence, considering Ukrainians to belong to the Russian nation, and Ukraine to belong to Greater Russia. In 2006, Putin reportedly stated, "Ukraine is not even a state." After the annexation of Crimea, he stated in July 2021 that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. In February 2020, leading Kremlin ideologue Vladislav Surkov stated, "There is no Ukraine." According to international relations scholar Bjorn Alexander Dubin, among the Russian public it is commonly regarded as self-evident that Crimea has historically been Russian territory, but also that all of Ukraine is in essence a historical part of Russia. In 2022, UK Defence Minister Ben Wallace characterised Putin's article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians as a skewed and selective reasoning to justify, at best, the subjugation of Ukraine and at worst the forced unification of that sovereign country. Removal of Russian street names and monuments across Ukraine. On April 26, 2022, the sculpture under the People's Friendship Arch in Kyiv, which depicted a Ukrainian worker and a Russian worker standing together, was dismantled. The arch and the People's Friendship Arch monument are also planned to be renamed and to become a new monument. This would be one of the first steps in a plan to demolish about 60 monuments and to rename dozens of streets associated with the Soviet Union, Russia, and Russian figures across Ukraine. Days before the People's Friendship Arch statue was removed, Aspects of this street renaming and monument removal plan were already being carried out across other areas in Ukraine as well. Ukraine has decided to rename the streets of Ukrainian cities named after such Russian historical figures as Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky or Leo Tolstoy. See also: Russia-Ukraine relations in the Eurovision Song Contest. Ukraine Commonwealth of Independent States relations. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. Russia-Ukraine border and Russia-Ukraine barrier. Russian military intervention in the Syrian civil war. Occupied territories of Georgia. Ministry of Temporarily Occupied Territories and IDPs. Temporarily occupied and uncontrolled territories of Ukraine. Russian-Ukrainian Information War. 2022 anti-war protests in Russia.